she knows the place better than we do, and she knows our way, and so on and so forth. No, she has come several times already, and kindly made a lot of presentations for the general public, for specialists as well, and so on. So I will have to introduce her because I think not everyone in the room necessarily knows Federica. Look, Federica is an Italian scholar in the first place. She's Italian, but she has worked in so many places in Europe, apart from Russia, maybe never in Russia.
Not in Turkey, yeah.
No, not in Turkey, so not everywhere then. She has worked in many different places in Europe, including mostly the UK. I think this is where you've spent most of your career as an academic. I haven't checked, but this is my impression. You tell me if I'm wrong.
I am at the edge with the Netherlands now.
Okay. So she's now based in the Netherlands, and so she's a philosopher of science, of course. She's very well known in philosophy of science for her work on causality and causal modeling in different sciences, especially social sciences and medical sciences, of course, but causality being a very general fact or concept in science. She has also views on different other sciences. She has published several books and many articles on various topics, some of them very general in scope, and some of them very specific on for instance, on a research program, a specific research program, in particular in philosophy of medicine, which is a part of her work I know best, as for myself. And last thing I wanted to say, she has also been a part of the development of the very active part of the development of the so-called movement EBM+. So EBM means evidence-based medicine. So this is a very important movement in medicine at the moment, or has been for years now. Evidence-based medicine, meaning that we have to replace interventions in medicine with interventions based on evidence. And of course the question that everybody raises is, and what on earth was it based on before? And so it's a very specific view on evidence, and this has been discussed a lot at length by philosophers among others, of course, and Federica has been a major part in that, especially with the paper she wrote together with John Williamson, which is a paper very, very well known in philosophy of medicine, a paper on causality and evidence in particular in medicine. How is evidence made exactly in medicine? Okay, but I don't think this is what she's going to talk about today at all. But this is an important introduction, I mean, to those of you who don't know Federica. Yes, okay, so Federica, I think that's enough, apart from the fact that we love to have you here. I won't say much more, and I'm giving you the floor to present your talk.
Thank you. And thank you for the very, very generous and kind introduction. It is so nice to be back. As you said, it's probably my fourth time I come, so it does feel like coming home. And now I know my way. At least I kind of understand how to get from the tram stop to the lab, which is already quite an achievement. So what I'm trying to do in this talk is possibly two things. One is to try out ideas I have about technology in the sciences in general and in the earth sciences in particular. And what I would like to do is to see how the moment in which we take very, very seriously the role technologies have in the sciences, there is an array of concepts in philosophy of science that need to be changed, adjusted, rethought, reconsidered. And the second thing I want to do is to focus on technologies that are related to aging in some sense, because this is something that together with Maëlle and Thomas are working on as some kind of ideas for long-term projects. So in a sense I'm using this opportunity in two ways, and as you will probably notice in the course of the talk, what I'm saying is much more programmatic than systematic, and hopefully the more systematic part should come. And I'm talking about opportunities and challenges because it seems to me that many of these technologies do open up opportunities, some of which are not fully explored. They also open up challenges, and the challenges I have in mind mainly concern the normative sphere, ethics, political philosophy, what we do in public health, interventions, etc. And I'm using opportunities and challenges because now that technology is so much on the rise, there is a lot of this dichotomous thinking that either technology is bad or it is good, and the gray area are really kind of left a bit out. So what seems to me important to be done is really to go deep into a discussion of what technology can do, or once it does it something, then to understand what is changing and what happens. So maybe part of what I say, especially in the beginning, will be kind of a deja vu to you, or perhaps a bit boring, but I'm trying to set the stage for why looking into this technology and in the way I do. Well, it's now at the end, so I was very quick. I don't know what is going on, I'm sorry.
Not boring at all.
Okay, so I've been super...
I think it was not in the direction.
Okay, possibly, okay. Now I press the button in the right direction, so you see sometimes the technology tricks you. But, so, I want to start this as a preamble, something that virtually nobody is going to disagree with, the pervasiveness of technology, difficult word to pronounce. And here basically you have just a long shot of images that recalls you how much technology has been there with us through the course of history, and now in the current times across the sciences. If you think of current science, there isn't a single domain that is not making use of technology, from the earth sciences to physics, and even the humanities nowadays are deeply entrenched with the use of this technology. What does this mean? It may mean a number of things, and of course I'm not claiming that there has been no discussion of technology at all, especially in the humanities. Of course there is a whole field, science and technology study. There is a whole field within philosophy, this is philosophy of technology, and there are scholars from a number of areas that have taken interest in technology. But it seems to me that philosophers of science have comparatively looked into the technology used in science much less, with notable exceptions, of course. And so it seems to me that there is indeed quite some scope for us, philosophers of science, to look into what these technologies can do and what kind of question they open, reopen, or how we have to reframe a number of debates. And as I was saying in the beginning, what interests me there is that this dichotomous way of thinking, very utopian or very dystopian, is the wrong way to go. So that's exactly not the take I will have in this talk. I'm not going to argue for the horrible things technology is doing for health, that all is technologized and then medicalized, etc. That's not the way I'm taking at all. There is a lot to be said about what we can do with technology, what technology helped us achieve in terms of results, and what we want to achieve with the technologies. And it is exactly in this middle ground that the difficulty lies, and this is what I want to explore. So, beginning with contextualizing a bit better what I want to do with these technologies in the sciences and specifying the technologies I want to look at, I will go into kind of the central part of the talk. And the technologies I selected are of two types. On the one hand are omic technologies that have been used in the past 10-15 years in molecular epidemiology, and this leads me to investigate the concept of allostatic load. And there are many reasons for why I find this concept quite interesting. I hope to explain to you and also motivate you that this deserves a much closer investigation from a philosophical perspective. Some of these reasons have to do with conceptual problems. What is allostatic load? How we measure it, and what does this tell us about, notably about aging? And some other questions have to do with what do we do with such a concept and with the results that stem from this kind of research. And this, what I have in mind is what kind of public health interventions should we set up if we have to follow the knowledge that comes from this strand of research. So remaining in the big area of aging, I then look at technologies for active or healthy aging. And here I'm interested not so much in the technicalities of these technologies, but I want kind of to take a bit of a step back and try to see why do we have these technologies? Why do we want to develop more of these technologies? And what these technology can do for us, and whether we like or do not like the unintended consequences that these technologies have. So you see, even from this very brief overview, you see that I'm constantly playing with, on the one hand, the philosophy of science concepts, methodology, epistemology, and then on the other hand, with more of the normative side, the ethics part, the policy part, and the reason why I want to do that is not because I have super clear ideas of the answers that should be given, especially to the normative part, but it is because it seems to me that we have to put on the table both sets of questions and see how we can answer them more in a synergistic way rather than in an isolated way. And then I will be closing by reflecting about what philosophy has to add or to contribute to these discussions, hopefully showing that what I'm trying to do is very much in line with the field in biomed that is kind of the core of the business in this place. And so not to invent a new approach to it, but to say, yes, I mean, you're singing and I want to be part of your choir, and hopefully I have something to add to this approach in line of research. All right, so partly things that I've already said, but it strikes me as quite important to notice that technology may radically change our ontology, not reality, also reality per se, but mainly how we make sense of reality. It may change radically our epistemology, which is and especially the ontology and the epistemology part is something that I'm really, really interested in. I will not have time to develop this in this talk, but just to give you like a preview. Since I will be talking about molecular epidemiology and biomarkers research, there is a very interesting question to be asked about the ontological status of biomarkers. That's one thing that I mean by it may radically change the ontology or how we make sense of the real, and the epistemology that goes with it, of course. Ethico-political framing of the questions is the most obvious area where technology is making a difference because it's under our eyes. Social media, the digital revolution, I mean, all these ethical questions, privacy, confidentiality, we think they are an effect of the technology, but in fact this is a kind of an epiphenomenon. Now it is so big that we cannot ignore it anymore. But I would like at some point to be able to have a framework, especially in a scientific context, to look at ontology, epistemology, and the normative part as a one big problem, and we need kind of specific entry point, sure, but I mean they are not isolated and separated issues. So that's kind of the very, very long research program that I have. Of course, that's not what I'm going to address here. Here we'll be making much more confined claims, as I said, more programmatic than systematics, and much more particularized to the earth sciences, and even more specifically about aging, very broadly construed. So the technologies that I selected for this kind of exercise are, on the one hand, technologies that we use to study health and disease, and these are specifically omics technologies, so technologies that allow us to study biological specimens at the molecular level, really going into the details of what happens inside the body, basically. And something that really interests me here is that this technology allowed scientists to conceptualize and measure allostatic load. And the reason why I find allostatic load interesting is that this relates to aging as some kind of biological phenomenon, but not necessarily just biological, also epigenetic, and to socioeconomic factors, which is an area where I have a lot of questions for. the role of socioeconomic factors is not something that people are contesting. On a statistical or epidemiological level, the relation has been established for decades, so that's not the problem. But how do we justify, or how do we explain why and how socioeconomic factors affect health and disease in many ways? That's still to be investigated. And it seems to me that there they have a starting point to give a number of answers. And the policy implications are not obvious. On the other hand, here we have technologies that are there because we have to cope with aging populations. This is just a fact. You look at the demographics, populations are aging, and we don't investigate here why it is so, but it is so. And so what do we do? And so these active aging or healthy aging technologies are there attempting to slow down the process in some respect, or to cope with the conditions of elderly people in many other ways. So, for instance, they try to compensate for lack of social support. That's basically what they do. They also claim that they do it because we have to speed up intervention to individual elderly people when they need it, and the technology can do this for you. And this, to me, opens a number of ethical challenges because, of course, the way in which we design the technology is implicitly or explicitly shaping up a vision for society that we want. And so we may also use the technology to change this vision. And again, I won't have an answer or a positive view to offer you, but I would like to be able to put on the table a set of questions for discussion. So, with this setup, I will begin with omics technologies, and I need to go like a step back. There is this exposure science that tries to conceptualize the exposome. The exposome means, very briefly and very roughly, the totality of exposure. And they normally distinguish between the general external, the specific external, and the external. So the general external includes social capital, stress, psychology, social factors. Instead, the specific external includes chemical, viruses, radiation. In the specific external, you will find, for instance, environmental factors, which is something that parts of epidemiology have investigated quite in detail, but at some point, molecular epidemiology, as I hope to show in a few slides, really changed the way they do the measurement. And the internal exposome includes metabolism, gut microflora, and these are things that we are able to measure right now. And so the interesting part here will be how to connect these three. And the first part of the project that we'll be talking about have been connecting these two, the specific external and internal, and now they are also able to connect the general external to the internal via allostatic load, for instance. So, how we make this transition? As I said, environmental exposure and disease is something that have been studied for decades, and things have been established quite securely. How do we know that stuff like air, water, chemicals cause a number of conditions or disease? Here I'm in my discussions with Mael. Not all of these things may be disease, properly speaking, according to him, but kind of allows some kind of imprecision in the terms for now. And what traditional epidemiology was able to do is establish correlations between classes of factors and classes of disease. What molecular epidemiology has done is shifting the measurement at the molecular level. So we identify biomarkers of exposure, of early clinical changes, and of disease. So all of a sudden, kind of the reference is not the population as a whole, but many individuals making up a population, and within individuals, actually our bodies. So the population is the population of our molecules, if you want, and not the population of the individuals per se. Let me try to elaborate on this idea. What traditional epidemiology has been done here is establishing the categories, and here changing the measurement, really going down to the molecular level. It is as if you want to find the causal relations, and here you have a big strainer with big holes, and of course there is a lot that goes down, and here you have a strainer with very tiny holes, and hopefully you can really get hold of the true causal relations, because you know what, finally you are inside the body and you get a proper understanding of how comes that if you breathe polluted air, this does something bad into your body. So this is where, this is kind of how it goes. Now, there is research that spans at least the past 15 years, not only this project, but these are the projects that I've been following more closely. Environmental markers, exposomics, and life path is the latest one. Big consortia funded by the EU. One of the leading institutions is Imperial College, and Paolo Vina is one of the leading epidemiologists. I'm mentioning him because in the many discussions I had with him, I was really trying to understand what he was after. And this is something that in the beginning worried me about, because if you can think of a super interesting and kind of an incredible opportunity to use the technology to see down at the molecular level what happens in response to environmental factors, etc., the danger is there that, guess what, the experience of health and disease is over-biologized much more than it currently is. But what has happened in my understanding of this project is that they went down and tried to understand the relations between these environmental factors and health and disease, going down to the molecular level, and the next step has been, how can we understand the changes at the molecular level that are effects of, for instance, socioeconomic factors? Because this has been a kind of the big black box of a large part of epidemiology. The correlation is there, nobody is denying it anymore, but it remains a correlation. And it seems to me that there the technology is helping you to establish part of the answer to the how. There has been a lot in terms of it is the big data, you know, it is because you can finally analyze not just some data or large data set, but the big data that this is going to make the trick. But in fact, to me, it is more the technology than the big data that is driving the change, because the technology is central to all these stages: the generation, the processing, the storing, archiving, curating, analyzing data. So, sure, the big data part is there, but without the technology, you wouldn't have the generation of data in the first place. So, my intuition is that look at the technology and you will see how you have to think much harder about the data, think harder about the entities you're talking about. Some of these things, as I said, I won't be developing here, but to me, a big question there is what actually a biomarker is. And epidemiologists have been very cautious in making biomarkers clear entities, but I have seen it in some philosophical papers that the temptation is very easy, you know. You can use these machines, you track them, and you see, oh, this is an entity, this is not necessarily an entity, okay? Happy to discuss this further in the question time, but you see, to give me even more kind of an idea of what is at stake there, this gives you a very overview of the numerous technologies that they use. In part of the projects, they were doing real-time experiments, people in Oxford Street in London breathing air and then taking the measurements right away. They have been designing portable backpacks to measure pollution in different moments of the day and in different places. So there is really a lot that they did to cross-check all these data sets, including developing statistical techniques to analyze this data and to make this matching between the biomarkers of exposure, the biomarkers of disease. So this is just again to restate the claim. It is pervasive, and if it is so pervasive, we need to pay attention to it, right? But what kind of results did they manage to establish? two, I would say. The first one, as I mentioned before, for some chronic diseases, they manage to partially reconstruct the process from exposure to environmental factors to the onset of disease and then severity. So what we are able to do is to partly track biochemical molecular mechanisms that are responses to pollution, certain chemicals, you name it. Okay? So, quite a big achievement, I would say, in understanding the biochemistry of health and disease. To me, the other important result is that by crossing the data from these omics analysis at various stages in life, with data about the demographic characteristics and socioeconomic status, now they are able to at least start an explanation of how the social gets under the skin, how, as some people say. And so to me this means that finally socioeconomic determinants can be considered as proper proximate causes, because that has been also part of the narrative. Yes, they are causes, but they are remote, they are distant, or they are used to classify. So one way or another, socioeconomic factors have not been considered as real causes in a proper sense. And this, hopefully, justifies the idea that they are causes. But, and this is the part that interests me, if they are causes, you should be able to intervene on them in some way, right? Allostatic load, that is one of the central concepts that I take, and it is part of the second type of result that we are establishing. How to define allostatic load is something I discussed for the previous hour and a half with Maël, so I hope I'm not making big mistakes here, but what I understand from what they are doing is allostasis is something that everyone has. Our bodies do that constantly to compensate for various stresses that we experience in life. But there is something that we pay, it's a price that we pay over time if we have to compensate constantly or for too long or too much, okay? And this is something that they say they can measure. This is something that apparently now we can operationalize in a sufficiently clear way, and especially something that will become visible at the level of the immune system. And so in a sense it translates into an epigenetic age of the individual. And this is where I make the link with aging, because it seems that there is something to explore further. So, aging is something that everyone experiences, is ineluctable that we have to get older, but then it means that our demographic age, biological age, epigenetic age may not coincide. And this possibly creates part of the problem that we have to understand. When and how some of these aspects of aging becomes faster than others, under what conditions, for instance. And especially the accelerated biological aging process is partly explained to the exposure to these environmental factors, but also to adverse socioeconomic conditions during the life course. And some interesting results that they managed to establish is that actually the exposure may begin very, very early in life, even in uterus, and apparently probably even earlier than we are born. Just to give you an idea of papers that make these claims, here in this paper, this is exactly what they did, reanalyzing biological specimens, tracking this biomarker of the allostatic load, and then noticing that even for various measurement of socioeconomic status, they find quite consistent result. It does make a difference, it is related, and they hint at an explanation of how it is so. Kind of there is a response of the body to these things, and this is reflected long term, and this is how we become sick of certain classes of diseases. Another one which is just out, and you see here in the title, they are providing an idea that they are eliciting part of the mechanisms. And what I find also interesting is that it is the life course of socioeconomic inequalities. And this to me speaks about how we have to revise our concepts of health and disease, not so much as events, but as processes. Processes that we can understand if we identify key points in time. And this timing may have a span that starts even in utero and goes on. So quite a lot of food for thought. Of course, they also are aware of the limitations of these studies. There is still a lot that needs to be done, but I mean, the basics, a starting point is there. Now, let me move on to the other side of what interests me in this whole discourse on technologies and allostatic load and biomarkers, etc. So, we establish some kind of scientific knowledge, and my question is, if you establish certain scientific facts, knowledge, what kind of actions should follow? Now, the goal, you may say, is quite straightforward. What we want to do is to reduce the burden of disease. But here, notice that there is a kind of an outdated, oversimplified infectious disease model whereby, you know, identify the virus, isolate the virus, and then you just limit the exposure. Whatever the pathogen is, it will be easy just to reduce the exposure to that. But here the problem is that you need, you have complex exposures, and so your intervention cannot be a simple one, as simple as giving antibiotics or reducing the exposure in other simple way. Causation is complex, and the intervention must be complex. This is something that I investigated with Mike Keane for many years, director of public health at NICE in the UK, a sociologist by training, and the point we try to make in this paper is precisely to say a simple narrative whereby exposure causes disease, therefore just reduce exposure, you will reduce disease, is not going to work. There is a lot to be said about the conditions in which the exposure happens that tells you what can be done in very specific places. Of course, the consequences of that is that many big public health interventions are bound to fail. Not all of them, of course, because banning smoking is working. It took so many years for the authorities to implement that, but this is a kind of a very coarse-grained public health intervention, and if you want to target a specific group, then you may have to tailor this much more closely. Now, connect this to what I said about allostatic load and the role of socioeconomic factors. How are we going to intervene on that? So, there is a set of questions that are to be asked, from the concepts, the evidence, the science that we have, to the actions. Role of scientists and of experts in these processes, the relation between scientists and policymakers, the design itself of decision making, etc. So these are all things that STS scholars are already investigating, and still needs quite a lot of attention. To me, a key pressing question is what kind of ethico-political principles or values are at work? So how are we matching kind of the science with the values, implicitly or explicitly, and in either direction? To me, this is not obvious at all, that from the kind of research done by these groups that I mentioned before, you have a very straightforward public health intervention. They are struggling to inform public health, and for a good reason, it seems to me, because if they are right in making these claims about socioeconomic status, the allostatic load, and then the diseases, well, the intervention cannot be simple and at the level of the biology of disease. It has to be about socioeconomic structures. But how do you change socioeconomic structures? I mean, you open a Pandora box. I'm not saying we don't have to address it. I think I want to address it. And the way in which I want to address it is precisely by putting this kind of question at the center, that if society asks science to produce certain kind of knowledge, then we should also be prepared kind of to push the knowledge into actions in a certain way, and not hide behind interests of various types. So I know how problematic this can be, but it should be somehow on the table. So this sums up the difficulties in setting up public health interventions that I just mentioned. What to intervene upon, how, whom to include into the target groups. So if you take at face value the results of that kind of research, it is very, very difficult to see what to do then. Not impossible, but very difficult, very challenging, and something that I hope philosophers have to contribute to. I think I'm taking quite a lot of time, but it should be fine. So this now brings me to my other side of the technologies I wanted to look at. So these are active and healthy aging technologies. Here the vocabulary shifts a bit. They started talking about active aging, and now it is more the healthy aging, but I will use them interchangeably for simplicity. So, aging is a clear focus of, for instance, WHO for the next 15 years. Priority of EU funding in terms of support, vision, and it has to be implemented at a very local level. I take this definition of healthy aging from one of the dedicated pages from the World Health Organization. It is the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being in older age. So I hope you agree with me that even this simple definition is loaded with values of what it means to be healthy, functional ability, well-being, and all these kind of things. But okay, this is their working definition, and this is what we will work with. Now, what can be done? Quite a lot. So I was browsing this report commissioned by one of the directorate of the European Commission, and it is reviewing a number of projects at European level developing technologies for aging. Okay, so what can be done in terms of better understanding the aging process? Can we slow down the aging process? Are we coping with the aging process? How? I mean, these are kind of questions that are pretty much in the background of a report like this. And this gave me quite a lot of insights about what is going on in there. But a couple of things were quite striking to me. And I'm going to use two of their tables to show them to you. So one is that there is quite a lot that can be done in terms of the type of technologies that are being developed. Robotics, telemonitoring of bodily functionalities, technologies to activate elderly people so that their cognitive functions don't slow down, something to detect very early that you should intervene, technologies that help this intervention, they put them in touch with the health services much earlier. I mean, a lot there that has to do with monitoring, with prevention, and these are just acronyms of projects that are kind of dealing with these things. It is quite fascinating what you can do with these things, how creative engineers and scientists have been so far. It is, I wasn't aware of how much is out there, and there is really a lot. But what I found quite noticeable is that this table that you don't need to read in full, but it gives you an idea, this summarizes the expected impacts of the projects of the previous table. So the first column is the expected impact in improving quality of life. The second one is increasing efficiency of the health and long-term care. And the third one is market growth and expansion of the EU industry. Boom! You see? So my question there is, why are we developing all these technologies if, you know, after all the expected impact, and so by design of the project, it looks like this is what we are most caring about, that there is an opportunity for the market, an opportunity to make our industry grow, and coincidentally, we should be able to improve life. I mean, is this kind of the message are we sending out to society? So maybe I'm reading this completely wrong, but I found it quite astonishing that the expected impact by design of how these projects are set up makes the economic and financial aspect nearly a priority with respect to the health part. You see, you read then reviews like this one, and you really get a sense again of how much is out there, the variety, the difficulty in assessing the use of all these technologies, and you know, in the end, it is quite mixed what you can really infer from all this body of knowledge. Namely, that I mean, the real use or the real added value of this is yet to be established. But you know, that part worries me more than the rest. So, what I didn't find so much in the documents I read is the possibility of having an opportunity to use some of these technologies to have more data to understand the process of aging better. Of course, if you use these technologies to gather more data, you have quality of data, possibility of merging databases, confidentiality and privacy. I mean, these are all important caveats and should be there and should be part of the research design. But the technologies are there and they are gathering data anyway. So perhaps a question to be asked there is, can we also design the technology in a way that this generation and storage of data can then be instrumental to improving on our understanding of aging? Is it possible? The second point is, what worries me the most is a challenge at, especially at the ethico-political level. So what is the kind of vision of aging and of society and of the caring responsibility that are either assumed or promoted with these technologies? You scan through these technologies, and what they try to do is to minimize the dependence of elderly people onto other people, maximize prevention and the speed of interventions, as I said, and also slowing down the aging process. So in a sense, what we gain is that we get older, but many of our functions remain nearly intact, so we remain autonomous, as if this is the main value to preserve. They don't really make an incentive to promote social structure and social support. And so in a sense, an ethics of care or a value like empathy are not implicitly or explicitly promoted by using these technologies. Are we happy with that? As I said, I'm not going to argue for one or the other vision. It just strikes me that if this is really what these technologies are doing, especially the dependence and the slowing down, implicitly there is an idea that getting old is bad, is ugly, and we should kind of minimize the impact of that, because also there is a big worry about intervention, prevention, and the health services, and this is a financial burden. And of course, I do not want to be idealistic that money is illimited and our health services should function as if we had no financial constraints, but how do we want to align the financial constraints to the values? I think it is a question that should be put on the table. Right. So let me try to summarize and conclude what I was trying to do here. The technologies abound. The two technologies in health that I was looking at are, on the one hand, those to study health disease, and specifically omics technologies that allowed us to conceptualize allostatic load, which is related to epigenetic age of an individual, and this seems to translate into interesting questions about public health interventions, in the sense that they are not obvious and they are not easy. Not kind of breaking news, but I think we have more reasons for why it is so. And also the tensions for why some of the interventions that seem so obvious to us are not implemented, possibly because there is really a difficult translation that goes from the science to the policy-making world. The other set of technologies, those that try to cope with aging population, these are the active or healthy aging technologies, are designed to improve the life of elderly people. But, I mean, implicitly or explicitly, they promote certain values, and somehow the development of this technology seems to be more of a worry for the potential financial impacts than the real impact on the life of the people, right? Now, why should we be looking at aging? This I find quite intriguing because on the one hand it seems to be a biological inevitable process, no? And yet there is so much that still has to be understood. And what is more, that is not just biological, that there is some part of kind of this social sphere that has a role in the biology of the aging. And this is something that has been on my research to-do list for quite some time, how the biological and the social sphere are connected, should be connected, can be connected. And so now it looks like aging is an excellent area, an excellent example, so to make these questions even more concrete. Why the technologies, as I was trying to motivate in the very beginning of the talk, because scientific knowledge is couched and even generated by these technologies. And so there we have a whole new epistemology to be developed. Some of these things have been done. If I think of the debates on data in philosophy of science, are part of this new epistemology. They are not always explicitly linked to technology, and in my view they should be. Also, because these technologies are designed to cope with aging and not value-free, so there is a kind of ethico-political chart that is connected to epistemology methodology and is not connected at the moment. So to me this is an important warning for us that we should realign our philosophy in the sense of philosophy of science with the normative part. And so hopefully you can see why kind of this approach, the way I'm trying to ask questions, the way I'm trying to select the cases is very much part of what you're trying to do in this lab. It seems to me that as philosophers of a certain type, we have much to contribute to understand the concepts. One case in point here is aging. To develop and assess methods, for instance, the omics technologies. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm just taking at face value all these scientists do. There is a lot of room for critical assessment of these technologies and their use, and then to reflect of the intended or unintended impacts of these concepts. One of those is healthy aging, allostatic load, so here is just one example of things that can be done and hopefully that can contribute to a broader conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federica. Time for questions. Thomas?
Thank you, Federica. It was very interesting. I have a question about the link between science and policy making, because I think this is very interesting and not so much what we usually do. So as I said before, I think this is very interesting. But with the example you gave, I'm not completely convinced, because as you said, for decades we have said there are some socioeconomic conditions that will lead to bad health, or at least some bad effects on health. And then, for example, recent science could suggest that, in fact, this is not so much bad health, this is accelerated aging, or this is the allostatic load is very strong.
Yeah.
But in terms of interventions, I guess it's pretty much the same in terms of politics, right? What should I do? I mean, as a policymaker, if I have the will to do something, if I have the money to do something, will it be changed by the recent science of this, for example, work on allostatic load? I think the things I'm supposed to do are pretty much the same, right? It is to act on some socioeconomic conditions that have these effects. So the traditional epidemiology was enough to determine the kind of interventions I'm supposed to do, right?
Yes and no. I mean, there I think you should also reason nearly on a case-by-case case. Or even depending on the broader context. But my first reaction to your remark is that was epidemiology enough? Maybe not, because many of the things epidemiology has been trying to say for ages took even decades to get implemented. So one way in which one could reply to your worry is that, well, we are giving extra reasons. This is one possible answer. Wait, we are giving extra reasons because if policymakers didn't act because they didn't believe the link between socioeconomic factors and health was strong enough, because there was no biological basis for it, and now we have it. So now you have the answer, now you should act. This is one way in which you could reply. The other one is that what this research is showing is that it is much more complex than that, because what counts as stressors in the course of life may be very, very different. And so how do you reduce the exposure to these stressors? It depends. So it cannot be that there is one public health intervention that will work in developed countries, in developing countries, in rural areas, industrialized areas, I mean, across different professions, target groups, etc. So even this, I think, shows that the interventions have to be targeted. Okay? Is this answering you?
Yep.
Because the other part of the answer I wanted to give you is that indeed there is a lot that is being done, and in fact, in developing countries such as Brazil, even working at the basic level of hygiene and sanitation makes a huge change in terms of the very basic health indicators. So that's why the interventions may be very, very different if you're talking about these kind of populations or populations like Western Europe. You see?
If I may add something to what you just said, there is a nice example. So first, there is a general principle, which is when you discover some new kind of causes, generally this has a strong impact also on the way you consider the effect, and you decompose the effect, and you change completely your views on the effect. And one nice counter-example to that is during the 1970s, there were these two sociologists in the UK who studied depression and who studied the social factors of depression. The whole report is in a book called The Social Origins of Depression. And this is a marvelous book with a very detailed view on what happens when you're a single woman, when you live in a flat which is too small for your family, when you have various risk factors that are more social than biological, much more, definitely. And the problem with that book generally is that they take for granted what psychiatrists define as depression in the first place. So what they are studying is only what doctors at the time were defining as depression. And what I mean by that is that I mean by saying that this is a nice counterexample, is that when you take all of these factors into account, this should lead you to decompose the phenomenon you're interested in different way, because you are studying different causes. So when you are, for instance, biologizing, let's say, some of the descriptive features of what you're talking about, then this should necessarily lead you to decompose the diseases you are studying in a different way as well, I think. So that's a mistake to take for granted if you're, for instance, a social worker, to take for granted what doctors say, and the reverse is true as well.
Yeah, if anything, to me this is also a prompt that we need much more research into sociology and anthropology of health, namely many more detailed descriptions of these conditions, because then we need to understand in detail how different socioeconomic stressors work in different populations. So I wouldn't say that this is an end point. To me this is only a starting point, and I would add a starting point that gives to the medical humanities broadly construed even more importance and more weight.
Well, thanks a lot for a very fascinating talk. Many things to address, so just let me pick out one thing. So if I were wearing my reductionist coat today, which I'm not, I could argue, well, there are so many things we still don't understand about the biology of aging. Why make things even more complicated by talking about potential socioeconomic factors? I wouldn't agree with that kind of argument that people might put forward, especially when we don't want to just focus on the study of aging, but when it comes to coping with aging. Because I was curious to hear what you were thinking that the prospects of having a target of intervention on this level being more promising than the idea of some aging researchers making bold claims that we might soon live 1,000 years and so on, whatever, based on the biological study of aging, which is very unrealistic, whereas the socioeconomical target of intervention, there is something more realistic, even though we might not understand a chain of mechanisms from these factors to the molecular effects in a reductionist way, but still it's much more accessible for being a target of intervention. I was curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So somehow you are asking about what would be, in my view, the connection between the two types of technologies?
In a way.
Good question. I don't know. So I must say that the articles I read from kind of these exposure science researchers never make these bold claims that now we understand the aging, and of course this is the gate to kind of limited lives and we can live healthy until under 20. No, they really don't. If anything, they really pointed to the difficulties in translating the results into public health interventions that can be really implemented. Perhaps it is striking that there is a direct connection between the two. And if I were one of the researchers in this exposome science, I would like these technologies developing the active aging technologies to help me gather more data to understand what is going on in there. So instead of having them developing their own agenda to make more money with these apps, etc., I would actually bring the technology back at the service of a very legitimate scientific goal. I don't know if this answers your part.
Let's hope we can see that feedback between those two lines of research.
Other questions? Yes,
so epidemiology is evolving and improving. I think one must not oppose epidemiology and technology. Epidemiology uses technology, and now epidemiologists use genomic data, exposome, and so on.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that, and I like it. When I was studying in the beginning this relatively new field of molecular epidemiology, it was interesting for me to learn how much molecular epidemiologists had to establish the legitimacy of their approach, because some other people in epidemiology were saying that this is not epidemiology anymore, as if they were betraying the principle of what epidemiology is about. I wouldn't take that route either. I think it is a very welcome step in that field, that they were able to take advantage of some of these technologies and to use them to understand health and disease at the epidemiological level. So I'm totally happy with that. I don't want to create the opposition. Do you think this was the impression I was giving, that there is a kind
you spoke about traditional epidemiology. So epidemiology has evolved gradually, and so uses more and more data from which are generated by technology, and on one way, and also they use data, more and more longitudinal data, which allows to go a little further than simple correlation between disease and factor. It's more than correlation when you study the evolution of disease over time.
I agree. If anything, there is more of a continuum than a big kind of fracture or breaking in the tradition. But I did read some contribution in which this was a kind of questioned, although it didn't seem to me a very valuable line to pursue. It was being very traditionalist in a way that wouldn't help the field. So I would totally take your point that we should show more of the continuity than the differences.
I have an additional question back. So maybe when I'm sorry for that, I had to take care on the and it's to me it's very unclear what it means, because it's a bunch of various conditions, like for instance aging without comorbidities. Well, that's not very clear, because aging not being a disease in itself, the rest cannot be comorbidities. I mean, generally comorbidities are associated to a disease, not to something else, but it makes sense to do that. Or is it slow aging, as you mentioned? Or is it aging depending on, aging with happiness or well-being, which is not incompatible with some diseases maybe, or aspects of disease? So it's not clear, and each time it looks like it's the same concept. It's something like, okay, we cannot do much about aging because we are aging, and that's all. But we can modulate a little bit what happens when we age, and this is all it seems that there is, at least to me, in these concepts of healthy, successful, and whatever aging.
Yeah, I take your point entirely, and in fact, in reading the documents of the WHO, it was quite striking that they have a very simple and all-encompassing definition, and then in the line you read, yes, but I mean, each individual has its own specific aging process, so we cannot really put everyone in the same basket, and what it means to be old and less autonomous for one is not the same as that. So implicitly recognizing that it seems to be a universal value, for instance, remaining autonomous may not be. This is one of the things I think you want to point at. Or having some health conditions may be more of a burden for some people and less for others. How do we accommodate for these differences? So to me there is a lot to be said about how we design and we target these technologies for specific groups, leaving, and this is where I want to talk about the autonomy of the individual to decide whether they want to use or not these technologies. Whereas, as it often happens with the technologies, the possibility of designing, developing, and using them is more important than the reason why we would like to have it. And for me, the first question is to choose the technology, not that technology is kind of on me and then I have to cope with the technology. So I would like to reverse the process. First thinking, what is aging? What kind of types of aging do we want to target, and for what purpose? With what kind of values to promote or to assume, and then to say, okay, and now we need the technologies.
Yes, and
I work a lot on personalized medicine during my PhD, and I just finished it. And I didn't hear you talking about it in this presentation, because to be honest with you, when I read the title of the presentation, I was like, well, yes, that's definitely a presentation for me, because we'll be talking about precision medicine, about AI, about algorithms, about all these fancy new deep neural networks and all that stuff. And you didn't say a word about all these. I just wanted to know why.
Lack of time. Lack of time, and so just making choices about the things that I wanted to put on the table for this kind of discussion. But I agree with you that another chapter of this kind of long, very, very long presentation should be about this personalized medicine, and how do we want to use, or is it currently in use, all these big data techniques and the algorithms, and the extent to which these algorithms are transparent and trustworthy for what we want to do, and what it means to use the term personalized medicine. Is it really about persons? I mean, many people object to that. It is not, and for good reasons. But then you should also open another chapter about how do you communicate to the patient that you are doing personalized medicine, and they feel it is about them, it's not about them. So yes.
And also privacy, by the way. How do you protect all these data that are stored here in the hospital, and then
yes.
How can we have access to this data
Yes.
to be able to do great things with it?
Yes.
And these are all problems that are working on right now, and there is not a solution yet
No.
to answer this kind of problem. So
I I agree.
I would have liked to hear a little more about that, but maybe next time.
I'm sorry, but yes, but I
That's
think
cool.
the question you ask definitely belongs in this in the broader scope of a presentation like this. Yes.
There are other videos by Federica where you can find at least some elements to maybe meet your needs. Yes. Jean-François, you had a
It's
question.
a quick one, a stupid one.
I hope so.
Talking about technology, what do you think about of transhumanism? This very
I don't have an answer to that. This is something that I'm thinking about. I mean, I know some of my colleagues are active in philosophy of technology and post-phenomenology have much clearer views on that, whether positive or negative or simply describing the possibilities of that. I don't have a clear view on that. I mean, it seems to me that it is never obvious to draw a line between the technologies that we think are legitimate and those that are not. Because just to give you a very simple example, if I lose a leg for a legitimate reason, for instance, it is cut because of some disease, or I am unfortunate and there is a mine in some war battlefield and I lose my leg, it is perfectly fine that I have a leg replaced. But if I cut my leg because artificial legs can make me run faster and this will make me a much more competitive athlete, I mean...
we can restrict this topic to aging.
Okay, so you were meaning more immortalism, which is a part of transhumanism, rather than transhumanism.
Immortality, I don't know, but it's improving. I mean, alleviating all the problems created by aging, by time at least, in one individual, one given individual.
I have reservations. I mean, it's something that we were discussing with Mael before. I mean, at some point we need to think harder about what is for us the experience of health and disease, and why we cannot accept it, and why we are constantly talking about fighting diseases, and why we really want to strive for live longer. No, I mean, I'm not sure we can provide a universal answer for everyone, but at some point I thought for myself that I need to ask myself the question, in case at some point I'm diagnosed with cancer, and I want to have my personal answer to whether I am ready or prepared to undergo 5
But is it not the goal of medicine to alleviate?
To alleviate is one thing.
First, and second, I mean, these people might just, they just want to make some money, maybe. So there is sort of a bottleneck here where everything is connected.
Yes, there is, but this is where I feel that the noble principles of medicine